All right, rejoining the channel is actually TJ. You're kind of like family, right? Because your late uncle and I were academy classmates, and also classmates going through the F-14 rag. TJ Arufo, who we lost back in '08. He is your namesake, right? I mean, that's who you're named for is TJ.
I think so. No one's ever officially in my family said it, honestly, but I would assume so, considering my uncle was TJ and then his nephew was named TJ. I don't know.
It sounds like more than coincidence to me. I just
Yeah.
saw your aunt and your cousin at our 40th reunion a couple of years ago here in Annapolis. So anyway, TJ and I are kind of like family. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah.
And we met a few years ago while he was working on a video project that I was one of the guests on, and we connected the dots. So when X equals space information, and frequent viewers of the channel know this because they've seen TJ on before, then we turn to him. And now, TJ, we come to you because we have two astronauts stuck, stranded in space. What is going on?
So right now, Butch Wilmore and Suni Williams, NASA astronauts, are on board the International Space Station. They flew up on Boeing's Starliner spacecraft. It was the first crewed mission of that spacecraft. The mission has had a variety of anomalies, as they say, that were not quite expected. But luckily, the astronauts are safe on board the space station. Now, it's not to say that they're stranded. NASA can be a little particular about the language, and it's not necessarily language that most lay people, quite frankly, understand. The astronauts have complete permission to use Starliner to, leave the space station in an emergency scenario. What NASA's concern is right now is that the vehicle has been doing things that they were not expecting. They've had some thruster issues. A variety of them were shut down during the docking maneuvers in order to maintain the attitude of the spacecraft. The automatic docking going into the space station did not work, so Butch Wilmore had to take manual control and fly the vehicle into the space station, which all happened seamlessly. And really, the core issue is right now that Boeing does not fully know what the root cause is of these thruster issues. They have been able to online all but one of them. They've been doing a variety of tests at White Sands and on orbit with these thrusters to try to track down what these issues are. And there's some theories that it's like some kind of Teflon O-ring situation, that they're having some thermal issues on board the spacecraft, or not necessarily issues, but the thermals are potentially messing with that O-ring. So, but they're not stranded. NASA has this requirement that there has to be a 1 in 270 chance to have a loss of crew event, and which is roughly 0.4% chance of loss of crew, which is very, very slim. 99.6% chance that everything's going to go fine. But if you double the risk of that, then you're looking at, what is that, 99.2% chance loss of crew, right? So these are still, the vehicle's still extremely safe in a lot of ways, but NASA really is trying to maintain crew safety. And if they don't fully understand what the issues are, they're working on alternatives right now.
So, because this channel is a naval aviation channel at its heart, I will point out that both Butch and Suni are naval aviators. Butch was an A-7 F-18 pilot. He fought in Desert Storm. Suni was an H-46 pilot. The path to get to the astronaut corps as a naval aviator is through test pilot school at NAS Patuxent River, and they both went through test pilot school. I'll also point out that Suni is a Naval Academy grad, class of '87. But if you look at what they did in NASA, it's an impressive resume, both of them. Both had multiple shuttle missions, both had Soyuz experience getting to ISS, both did cool, unique things. Suni owns the record for spacewalks. She owns the record for female time in space on the ISS. She ran a marathon. She ran the Boston Marathon on a treadmill on the ISS. It was going on. Butch did he printed a tool for the first time in space. So they've done some amazing stuff as astronauts in NASA. And as you mentioned, now that they've pivoted to the corporate world, more or less, I don't know, are they Boeing employees now, or are they still technically NASA astronauts?
They're both NASA astronauts. They're just flying on a private spacecraft.
So they were supposed to be up there for 8 days, and now they've been up there 2 months. And reports are that it could be as long as 8 months before they come back. So when I go on a mission to the ISS, I'm kind of thinking, if I think I'm going on a 2 day trip and it's actually going to be an 8 month trip, I'd pack a little different.
Yeah.
So, I mean, is everything on the ISS waiting for them? And so they're fully capable of staying up there as long as they have to. How does that go?
NASA did actually end up throwing in their go bags from before the flight onto the Northrop Grumman Cygnus spacecraft a couple weeks ago. So they literally took what they left at NASA in Florida and put it on that commercial resupply vehicle, so that when they had some literally more clothes to wear on ISS. Luckily, in space, you don't really go through clothes, for instance, as fast as you do here on Earth. You don't sweat as much, mainly. So it's very common for astronauts just to like put shirts on inside out and just try to extend the time of how long you wear clothes, because they also don't have the ability to really clean them up there. But when you're looking at potential alternatives to get them home, if NASA does deem Starliner not to be the safest option that they want, they'll have to come back on Dragon, which creates basically just kind of scheduling issues. Technically, it's not hard, but essentially the next crew mission, Crew 9, is slated to launch next month rather, to the space station, where NASA sends up 4 astronauts for a 6 to 8 month rotation up on ISS. And if they decide that Butch and Suni need to come home on a Dragon, NASA is going to remove 2 astronauts from that flight, astronauts who have been training for years for this mission. And the training involves, yes, a variety of dealing with things on ISS, but running science experiments and planned maintenance for the station that it takes years to plan for. They'll have to be removed from the flight, and that flight will send up 2 astronauts, and then Butch and Suni will essentially become part of the expedition, and stay up there for as long as NASA needs them to, until the next crew rotation comes up, which is, like I said, usually in about 6 to 8 months. So they went from planning on staying there for 8 days to now NASA having to be nimble here and like, okay, we have 2 very capable astronauts on board. They can do the work. There's going to be a lot of on-the-job training, so to speak, at this point, but they're very seasoned and they are capable, and they're leaders within the astronaut corps. So like, there's not really too much concern from that aspect. It's not good optically for NASA or for Boeing to be going through this. It's a lot of waste of time and money for NASA. There is concerns about the long-term health of the Starliner program. If the option is, we're not going to send the astronauts home, we're going to keep them on ISS and send up Dragon. When you pull back, look bigger picture, this is the 3rd test flight of Starliner. But at this point, Starliner was supposed to be operational several years ago and being part of the crew rotation to the space station. On the first orbital flight test, OFT-1, when Starliner got to space, its onboard clock was out of sync, and it basically thought it was in the wrong orbit. So its thrusters started firing erratically, trying to raise its orbit to get to the right place. And because of that, it essentially missed the space station because the clocks were off. On the second flight, they encountered a wide variety of valve issues on the ground. Valves were freezing that control the thrusters. And so they had to take apart much of the vehicle to diagnose what that was. And that pushed back the flight, that test flight, which was a repeat of the last one. That went back about 6 months until Boeing fully understood the issue, of which they blamed Aerojet Rocketdyne at the time for the issue, because they was the thrusters were kind of their purview in the contract. And that one, once it was flying, was fine. That mission was about 8 days on orbit. I can't remember exactly, but it was under 2 weeks that vehicle was in space. Now this third flight is the crewed flight, and they're now running into a whole other level of issues between the software and the thrusters that are not fully understood. And NASA basically needs to make the call on this by the end of next week, because they need to now plan for this next flight of Dragon. Okay, if we're going to pull astronauts, what is the plan, so that they can schedule this out properly to make sure there's like a smooth transfer of power, so to speak.
I want to drill down on the industry side, as you've hinted at some of the issues, Deaver. But For those who aren't intimately familiar with the configuration of the International Space Station, because I'm reading that, you just said Dragon and Starliner. So Dragon is the SpaceX craft and Starliner is the Boeing craft. These are the two competing private companies that are building spacecraft to shuttle astronauts and equipment back and forth from Earth to the ISS. So, as you mentioned, the options include using either one of those. So, right now, as we're talking, what is attached to the ISS and how many docking bays does the ISS have?
What's actually pretty cool when you really think about it is the variety of spacecraft that is now available for both cargo and crew on station. But right now, there's a Crew Dragon docked to the space station, there's Starliner, there's a Cygnus spacecraft, and there's at least one Soyuz docked. There's definitely at least one crude Soyuz. I can't remember if there's a Progress vehicle, which is like their equivalent of like their cargo vehicle docked to the station. The Starliner and Dragon and Cygnus can't dock on the Russian side. That side they have like their own mechanism that is not compatible. The American side uses what's called the International Docking Adapter, of which only Dragon and Starliner use right now. Talk about bugaboos again here. When if NASA does decide that they want to send Butch and Suni back on a Dragon, they will have to have the Starliner undocked from the station in order for that second Dragon to dock with station, which presents its own logistical problem. Where if that in that small window, which hopefully is just measured in days of there being no other vehicle attached, so that that other Dragon can attach to that other docking port. If there's an emergency scenario and you have now 6 astronauts inside of Dragon in an emergency situation where they have to escape, how do you properly secure them in the spacecraft to come home so that it's not putting the whole crew at risk, right? So they have to kind of workshop this now a little bit, these variety of emergency scenarios that could happen in these different situations, so we're not risking the crew's lives more than we have to.
So, just to be perfectly clear, how many astronauts of whatever nationality are currently aboard the ISS?
There are, am I doing my math right? 7, 8, 9 astronauts on board. There's 9 astronauts on board right now.
And how many Russians? How many?
3 came up on Soyuz, 4 came up on Dragon, 2 came up on Starliner.
So do they interface or
yes, yeah, constantly interface. The crews are very much intermingle and support each other. And the crew balance there. There's no like wall, right? They are very much, they eat together, they spend time together. They do spacewalks separately because the suits are different and there's some different processes there. But the vast majority of work is done together, and the crews make it a really big point to have that synergy, because you've been on a ship before, Ward, in a time of emergency, everybody has to chip in, right? And you need to be able to work together and trust each other. So that's a huge aspect of life on ISS.
So this is, in spite of the war in Ukraine, there is cooperation on the ISS by necessity.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
To get back to the different docking stations, so you mentioned if you have to take Dragon, then you're going to have to do something with Starliner, like set it adrift. Is that one of the things that might have to happen?
Right now, the way Starliner has been configured, it requires a human on board to press like an undock button, essentially, just to really, really water it down. It is capable of autonomous undocking and deorbiting, which it did on the previous flight, but Boeing did not configure the spacecraft for that on this flight, because part of a NASA requirement is when they have astronauts on board, there's a human in the loop element to a degree, right? So they have to engage certain steps in the process by hand. Really, all it probably requires Boeing is uploading a patch to their software to set up a new configuration for deorbiting and undocking autonomously. So it's likely that's not really going to be an issue. But what they would probably do is they would just undock and deorbit as they always would and validate the rest of the flight as much as they could to get as much data. So they're not just going to send Starliner off into some weird orbit. Like, the plan is to bring it back and land it as planned, as if people were on board, because it's in Boeing's best interest to, if that's the case, to put on a good show throughout so that the program has a potential to still continue.
Well, let me play a couple of excerpts of both Butch and Suni sort of putting on the good face, as you say, about their situation.
This is the world of test. This is a tough business that we're in. Human spaceflight is not easy in any regime. And there have been multiple issues with every spacecraft that's ever been designed, and that's the nature of what we do. You know, that mantra you've heard, failure is not an option. That's why we are staying here now.
It feels good to float around. It feels good to be in space and work up here with the International Space Station team. So, yeah, it's great to be up here. So I'm not complaining. Butch isn't complaining that we're here for a couple weeks.
So, TJ, the last time my former pilot and good friend, astronaut Scott Kelly, was on, we're talking about Ukraine. He was fresh back from the war and a sit down with President Zelensky. And the subject of NASA's dependency on the Russian space program came up. So let me play Scott's statement with respect to that.
When the space station was built, we made some very poor design decisions that put Russia in the critical path to keeping this thing safely in space. And that is the ability to control the space station's attitude. Your viewers know what that is, not altitude, but attitude, with propulsive attitude control. You don't have that on the US side of the space station. So, you know, we could spend hundreds of millions of dollars and take years and build this capability ourselves. That actually we had at one time before the space station was built, but it was canceled due to funding. And we could redo that, but by the time it was done, the space station would almost be done anyway, right? So we had to make this choice. Do we continue to partner with them in space, or do we let the space station just die, basically? And it was a tough choice, but we decided to go with keeping the space station running and partnering with the Russians. But I said, I guarantee you, and I have no position to do this because I don't work in the government, but I can almost guarantee you that we will never, ever participate with Russia, meaning this Russia. Maybe someday there'll be a different Russia, but with this Russia in space ever again.
In hindsight, the way that NASA sort of punted on the ability to get Americans back and forth, and in the wake of the wall coming down and all the bonhomie of the turn of the century and détente, and we assumed that everything would be kumbaya for decades to come. Obviously, it hasn't played out that way. So what does our current problem matrix say about the state of NASA and the American space industry?
Honestly, NASA has done a wonderful job isolating themselves from the Russian reliance into the future. Yes, Russia is our main partner on the International Space Station and was for the longest time the only way for American astronauts to get to space, but that's not the case anymore. There's multiple programs being developed right now for private space stations where NASA will be the idea, much like the commercial crew program, is that NASA is one of many customers, and NASA will invest their money in developing science and pioneering hardware technologies that then commercial industry can take those learnings and develop their own commercial products with them. You know, spacecraft and space modules, space station modules, being like key components here. So there's there's really three kind of leaders right now in the next generation of space stations. There's the Blue Origin Orbital Reef space station, which is under development. Axiom Space, they are developing a space station that was also going to be actually kind of built off of the International Space Station. Initially, they're going to bring up modules and dock it to the ISS and build it up and kind of give it a test run. And before ISS is deorbited for good, it'll undock, and that'll be like their new space station. And there's Varda Space, which has their own series of space stations that they'll be flying, where NASA, with all of these, the plan is to send astronauts to all of them and to send science to all of them and be completely independent of, the Russian partnership that we have today. Not even also including the Artemis program, which the goal there is to have an orbital outpost, an outpost on the surface that right now has several international partners to the Artemis Accord who are investing money and science and resources to make that happen. Russia has not signed on to the Artemis Accords. I'll be honestly a little surprised if they do, and anytime soon at least. So after the International Space Station, Russia is the one that's kind of in a bad spot here because they'll have nowhere to go. They have plans for another space station, but they have not started to really developing it hardcore. And if you look at the funding that Roscosmos has gotten and their launch cadence, especially since the beginning of the Ukraine war, it has decreased significantly. So outlook for the Russian space program is not looking good.
Well, that's great perspective. But to get back to our current circumstance, seems like we have sort of a Pepsi challenge between SpaceX and Boeing in terms of the craft, the manned vehicles that get astronauts, American astronauts, from Canaveral to the ISS and back. So can we contrast and compare those two companies? Because I think in general, SpaceX is thought of as the sort of the lean, mean, entrepreneurial, design, build, quality, cool sort of elan elements to what they do, including those cool spacesuits their dudes wear. Whereas Boeing has suffered from some huge PR hits associated with their commercial airliner program lately. Can any of the current problems with Starliner be attributed to that? And is the difference noteworthy in terms of the space industry in general?
There's a few things to look at with this. So when you look at how SpaceX and Boeing develop their hardware and their software, they have two very different methodologies. SpaceX is completely vertically integrated. They have very few subcontractors. Most of the tech is developed all in-house, whether it's the software or the hardware. And these are all people that are working together, and they do full up tests. They test things from end to end. Boeing's methodology, in particular with Starliner, is called like this waterfall development. So they have people working in different pockets of development, and they make assumptions of how other teams are working in terms of how their part of the ecosystem is going to interact. So they design their part, making those assumptions. And there's several subcontractors. Aerojet Rocketdyne is one I just discussed. They make the engines for Starliner, the thrusters and the engines. Because they have a wide variety of subcontractors and they're kind of broken up, when they bring all the pieces together, they don't always quite fit as they might expect. Boeing being a publicly traded company, they also operate differently in terms of how they budget and how they spend. They spend, obviously, they've spent a lot of money on this project, but there's rumors that they have tried to, I can't say this for certain, but the rumors are essentially that we're not testing things as thoroughly as needed, like SpaceX was doing, because the tests are very expensive. And because the way things are kind of broken up, the test programs are much more expensive than how SpaceX was doing it. So if there's any comparison to the airline aspect of Boeing and their space verticals, like that, there's probably some similarities there, but they're two very distinct verticals within the company. But when you're looking at how money is spent at the very top, I'm sure there's some kind of influence there with that. When you look at the different methodologies, SpaceX has been flying crew to the International Space Station now for 5 years, basically. And that just goes to show they both had their contracts executed at the same time in 2015. SpaceX charged less money and about half. Now, they did have some investment from earlier programs and stuff, so they were starting a little bit ahead in terms of technology development, but still, they delivered twice as fast for half the price as Boeing. And Boeing still has not fully delivered. So there's some core philosophical and project management issues that are afoot there. And also, just this past week, NASA's GAO put out a report analyzing Boeing's project management of the Space Launch System, which is a different vehicle, but it's still under Boeing Space. They're vertical. And one of their findings was that Boeing fundamentally lacks a lot of aerospace talent right now. And that's part of the reason why projects are being delayed and over budget and running into these issues, because they had a big talent. They lost a lot of talent, frankly, between the ending of the space shuttle and the ramping up of all these other companies like SpaceX. their core talent had left the company, and it's been hard for them to rebuild that. And, they're suffering for it right now.
So for you MBAs watching, what TJ just said is unlike what you're being taught in class about the goal of every founder and all shareholders during the first iteration of a startup is to make it to be publicly traded. That in many ways will make everybody at the table very rich, but it could be the beginning and the end of what makes your company great. So I'll just put that out there. So TJ, if you had to guess how this is going to play out for Butch and Suni, what would you say?
It really comes down to Boeing being able to explain what the fundamental issue is to NASA in the next basically 7 or 8 days. And if they can't fully explain that, NASA will likely pull the plug and send Butch and Suni home on Dragon. So they won't be coming home until about 2025. That's likely what's going to happen at this point, especially considering how long this has gone and how much testing they've done. And they don't fully have it valid, the core issue validated at this point. So that's likely what will happen. But either way, I fully trust NASA that they're going to make the right decision, whether it's to go home on Starliner or go home on Dragon. These are people who take this all extremely seriously. Crew safety is paramount. The space program cannot afford another Challenger or Columbia type incident. It would set us back a decade. Like it's just not an option. People need to trust NASA that they're going through these steps and they're taking their time with it. There's no gun to their head right now saying you got to send them home right now. No, they're chilling. They're working. They're part of the crew. They're contributing. And if there's an emergency, okay, fine. They'll send them home on Starline. There might be slightly more of a chance, but they're not stranded. They can get home if need be, but it might not be the best ride home is probably the best way to think about that. So I trust NASA. They're going to do the right thing here. We just have to let the professionals really analyze the situation and come up with the best outcome for the crew.
Well, TJ, it's always great to get your expertise on matters pertaining to space. We'll mention that you're about to relaunch your YouTube channel, I Need More Space, and we'll keep my audience posted on when they should subscribe to that channel if they're not already subscribed. You've been on kind of hiatus for a couple of years, so we look forward to the relaunch of your YouTube channel, and I hope we can see you in real life before too long.
I would love that very much, Ward, and thank you so much for having me on.
All right, that'll do it for this episode. If you're not already a subscriber, become one so you don't miss anything going forward. And in the meantime, I look forward to talking to you again very soon.